Welcome to our last video in this chapter where we're going to be exploring behavior modification techniques, and we're going to be learning about how we can use these techniques to change our own behavior. So let's now take the opportunity to apply some of what you're learning to your own life. So I'd like to read a series of questions to you, and these questions are in your textbook. They're in application 3.6, which is called Reducing Stress Through Self-Control. So I'm going to read 4 questions to you, and I'd like for you to answer to yourself yes or no. So here's the first one. Do you have a hard time passing up food even when you're not hungry? Number 2, do you wish you studied more often? Number 3, would you like to cut down on your smoking or drinking? And number 4, do you experience difficulty in getting yourself to exercise regularly? So each of these questions are related to self-control. And probably for many of you, you answered yes to at least one question. For some of you, you may have answered yes to more than one question. And it turns out that when we're under stress, when we experience many stressors especially, we have a reduction in self-control. So think about the different stressors that you've learned about in this chapter. You've learned about acute stressors and chronic stressors. You've also learned about internal conflict and frustration. You've also learned about many additional stressors, and then you learned about the consequences of these stressors. One of the consequences of these stressors has to do with how your brain functions. And we know that when we're under a lot of stress, or when we experience chronic stress, that we have reduced abilities to control our impulses. And this has to do with the changes that are taking place in our brain, that we rely more on those primitive structures of our brain, the emotional structures of our brain, than we do those that are involved in higher level processing. So it makes sense then that we would have trouble with self-control. So what we're going to be looking at is how can you use techniques in behavior modification to improve self-control? So the first question I have for you is, what do you think behavior modification is? Just listening to the phrase, what does it sound like to you? Well, the first word that you hear in behavior modification is behavior. And so perhaps as you heard that word, you thought about those things that are observable. Perhaps you thought about behaviorism. And behavior modification has its roots in behaviorism. And behavioral principles, as you learned in the last chapter, rely on concepts that are centered around operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So behavior modification focuses on specifically the environment and uses strategies like reinforcement and punishment and changing environmental variables that may lead to behaviors that we don't want, or changing environmental variables that may increase then the behaviors that we want. And those are called antecedent variables. So we're changing things about the environment that happen before the behavior. Behavior modification strategies and approaches can be used to treat lots of different issues. They can be used in the treatment of autism spectrum disorders, attention issues and disorders. They've been used in the treatment of smoking and also in drug addiction. They've been used in the treatment of childhood obesity, medication compliance, and these are just a few. So behavior modification techniques can be very effective. They're pretty easy to implement, and you can do this yourself. You don't have to have someone else implement these strategies for you. You can actually do these things, make these changes yourself. So as we explore this application, my goal is for you to be able to know how to use reinforcement, the control of antecedents, and punishment to either decrease or increase a particular behavior. And then I'd also like you to be able to analyze issues that are related to fine-tuning and ending a self-modification program. So in other words, if you implement strategies and you notice that they're not working very well, but they're working somewhat, That's what we're talking about when we talk about fine tuning. And then how do you end the modification program? What do you do so that you can continue that desired behavior or continue the reduction of that undesired behavior over the long term? So you'll notice here when you look at the phrase behavior modification, it is a systematic approach. So this is an approach that requires a very specific approach, systematic approach to changing behavior. So what you're doing is you are being very conscientious of looking at and analyzing the variables that are in the environment when you're engaging in, for example, an undesired behavior. You're also analyzing things like what is it that's maintaining the behavior? Why are you continuing this undesired behavior, for example? So let's say, for example, you bite your nails. So the question would be, what is it that's happening in the environment when you're biting your nails? And what are you getting out of biting your nails? And so an approach that we could take would be every time that you bite your nails, you could have a journal with you throughout the day. And every time that you bite your nails, you would want to write down what was happening when you did this. And then you'd also want to write down what happened for you when you did it. So what was happening in the environment, who was present, what was going on, where were you, what time was it? Were you in a specific class? Were there certain people present? And then you would want to, after you bit your nails, you'd want to write down also, how were you feeling after you bit your nails? How did you feel before? Were you feeling anxious and stressed? And then how are you feeling afterwards? And so what you're doing is you're analyzing those things that are in the environment, and then you're analyzing what is it that is reinforcing the behavior. So sometimes what's reinforcing a behavior can be something that's inside of you. So it's something that's intrinsic, so it feels better. You feel a reduction of anxiety, so it's internal. Sometimes reinforcement could be things like praise, recognition. It might be attention, whatever it might be. I think about those, especially if I was thinking about, let's say I wanted to change a behavior of one of my children. Because I'm looking at their behavior and not my own behavior, I probably would rely more on what I'm seeing than what I think they're getting out of it. Because remember, behavioral principles or behaviorist principles rely on objective measurement, and we only really know how we feel. Now, someone might be able to tell us how they feel, of course, but it's really, if we want to take a behavioral approach, if we're wanting to change the behavior of another person, then we would want to focus on those things that we can see, those things that we can measure. Okay, but as we think about this behavior modification approach here, we're talking about how do we change our own behavior. So if your behavior is, let's go back to some of those examples. If your behavior is, let's say, do you wish you studied more often? Would you like to cut down on your smoking or drinking? Do you find it difficult to exercise regularly? So when you look at these behaviors, do you wish you studied more often? We would say, well, that behavior is not happening enough. So what can we do to increase it? And we'd also want to know, what is it that is decreasing the likelihood that it's happening? In other words, what is punishing for us about studying? Okay, if we wanted to say smoking or drinking, we want to decrease that. We want to ask ourselves, what is it that's reinforcing about smoking or drinking? What are we getting out of that? And we would want to look at those variables that are present when we're engaging in that behavior. Okay, and we'd want to think about using punishment, for example. We might want to have a negative consequence for ourselves for smoking or drinking. That's one option. Another option would be if, let's say, for smoking or drinking, I was getting a reduction in anxiety or a reduction in worry because I'm feeling better when I use nicotine or when I drink, it's getting rid of those feelings, then I want to find something to replace that particular stimulus, cigarettes or alcohol, that could also reduce my anxiety or reduce my worry. So I'm replacing that particular behavior with something else. Okay, I'm replacing it with something so that I'm still getting the benefit, but I'm not engaging in that undesired behavior. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is, if we're looking at how are we going to change our behavior, we want to first start with a target behavior. So we want to ask, what is the behavior that we want to change? What is it that we think we're doing too much of or not enough of? And so let's say that our behavior is smoking or drinking. Let's do that. Let's just focus on let's use drinking as an example. So my target behavior is drinking alcohol. And let's say I feel like I'm drinking too much alcohol. So that's what I think I need to change. So the first thing I want to do is, I've specified my behavior. My target behavior is drinking alcohol, and I need to clearly define what I mean by that. And it's any alcohol. It's going to be anything at all. So it's not just beer, it's not just wine or liquor, it's all of those, any alcohol. So that's my target behavior, drinking alcohol. And the first thing I want to do after that, or the second thing I should say on my list, is gather my baseline data. So I want to know, how often is this actually happening? What am I actually doing? So I need to make sure that I have a notebook, that I have a pen, or I might do this using my phone. However, I want to be able to regularly record. And I want to be able to identify how much alcohol am I drinking. And I also want to record things that are happening and present around the time that I'm drinking alcohol. So I want to record whenever I drink alcohol. I want to record how much I'm drinking. And when I say how much, I want to be very specific. So I need to know, am I drinking 1 glass? And when I say 1 glass, I need to probably make sure that I'm aware of what I mean by 1 glass. Because, you know, when you hear people say that they just drink a glass of wine, for example, sometimes that glass of wine may be much more than what would be considered 1 glass of wine. It might actually be the equivalent of 2. So we have to be very clear about that. So what I'm going to do is, I have my notebook, and I like to write things down. So I think I would have my notebook. I like to use my phone too, but I think for this, it would be easier for me to just have a little notebook that I'm going to write in. And anytime that I find myself doing that, which I don't really drink much at all, but so I'm just going to say this, I didn't choose this because I feel that I need to reduce my alcohol consumption. But let's say that is this is the behavior that I choose. And so I choose to do this. I've got my journal, and anytime that I drink alcohol, I want to record some very important pieces of information. I want to record, what time am I drinking? I want to record who's present. I want to record what I'm doing when I drink. So for example, am I in the living room? Am I in the kitchen? Am I watching TV? Am I cooking dinner? Am I with friends? Am I with my roommates? Am I at home? Am I out with friends? What is going on? So I want to get as much information as possible. So I'm going to be gathering this baseline data so that I have a clear picture of everything that's related to this behavior, so I can understand when it tends to happen. So when I describe these things, I'm talking about what are called antecedents. And so antecedents are events that happen before the target behavior. So what's present before I engage in that behavior? What's going on? In other words, what I'm really going to be looking at is there something triggering this? Okay. And then I also want to make sure, again, that I'm very clear about how I'm defining that behavior. And as I'm gathering that baseline data, I need to make sure that I am very specific in my measurement. So I need to say, is it ounces? Is it glasses? Because I want to have a very clear, accurate picture of what behavior I'm engaging in. Okay, and this is critical for accurate data. All right. And so what you can do then is, as you record this over a period of days, is you can put this on a graph. And so you can see when this tends to happen, how often you're drinking on each of these days. Okay. So you're going to So you're going to be measuring the frequency of the behavior, or the target behavior, the quantity of that target behavior, like drinking alcohol in ounces. And then I want to know, what are the consequences of my behavior? So I want to identify what's reinforcing the behavior. So I'm going to keep this in my journal as well. So what's the payoff? What am I getting out of it? Am I feeling less anxious? Am I feeling more social? Am I feeling more confident? What am I getting out of this particular behavior? So we're going to measure this for a week at least, and maybe 2. So we want to get a really good picture of what's happening. The next thing that I want to do is, once I have all of that information, I want to be able to plan an intervention. I want to know I'm going to come up with how I am going to change this behavior. I either want to increase my behavior or decrease it. In the case of drinking, I want to decrease this behavior. If you're smoking, it's decrease. It just depends upon, or if you're smoking, obviously it's decrease. Another one might be like studying, if you want to increase the behavior. So that's what I want to do. So if I want to increase the behavior, I need to figure out, what's my reinforcement going to be. So if you want to increase studying, you're going to need to think about, what would that reinforcement be? And what is reinforcing for you may not be reinforcing for another person. So you have to think about what's uniquely reinforcing. And there's some good questions for you on figure 316 in your textbook that can guide you in selecting a reinforcer. So these can help you to identify what might be personally reinforcing for you. And then you want to make sure that you're only giving that reinforcement when you engage in that desired behavior. So you're not getting it at any other time. And you also want to arrange for contingencies. And so let's say, for example, you have a set of goals, like you say, okay, if I study 1 week for let's say 5 days out of the week, I study for at least 2.5 hours or 3 hours, whatever level I set for that week, then I'm going to reinforce myself at the end of the week with, so that's a contingency. I have to do this to get that. So that can be very helpful in setting longer term goals, but you don't want them to be too far disconnected from yourself. You don't want it to be, if I study for 40 days, 2 hours or 3 hours a day, I'll reinforce myself. You want to make sure you're regularly reinforcing yourself, and you want to make sure that you're setting challenging goals for yourself and that your goals are realistic. So you don't want them to be ridiculous. So you don't want to say you're going to study for 7 hours a day when, let's say, that's the only amount of time you have outside of school and work. That's probably not realistic. Would it be nice? Oh, I'm sure it would be really nice. And you'd probably find yourself getting really, really great grades in school. But I think you'd probably find you don't need to study 7 hours per day every day to get those grades. Of course, it does depend upon what program you're in and what you're doing, but 7 hours a day, 7 days a week, you might not be able to fit into your schedule. So you want to make sure that your goals are challenging and that they are at the same time realistic. And sometimes what we might do is we might use what's called a token economy. And this is where you get symbolic reinforcers that are then exchanged for genuine reinforcers. So you might, for example, on your refrigerator have points. So you get a point per day that you do this. And then at the end of the week, you see those points. And now you have, say, 5 points for 5 nights of studying in the way that you wanted to. And now you can trade those in. And this is pretty commonly used with kids, but it's also very effective with adults. And they provide a great example in your textbook of using a token economy for reinforcing exercise. And then you could also use shaping. So maybe you have a desired response that you want that is going to take a bit of time to get there. So the example that your textbook uses is, let's say you want to run a marathon, and we have all kinds of marathons in our community. And let's say this is going to be maybe it's going to be like a 10K or something, and you want to be able to run this. And so if you can't do this in the very beginning, which many people can't, you want to gradually reinforce the behavior until you get to that level, until you get to that place where you can run that far. So that's shaping, where you're reinforcing the behaviors that are closer and closer to the approximations of what is desired. Now, if you're wanting to, you're wanting to change undesirable behaviors, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to identify what is it that is reinforcing or maintaining that unhealthy behavior. So you want to figure out what is it that is keeping you or maintaining, for example, in my example, drinking too much alcohol. What's maintaining that? So what am I getting out of that? And so I probably need to find some things. If, let's say for me, I notice that I'm drinking alcohol and it reduces anxiety or stress, then I need to find alternative ways that I can do this. And I might decide that I'm going to reinforce myself for when I use these alternative ways of reducing stress. I also want to control those antecedents. So I want to be able to identify those things that trigger the behavior. If I notice I tend to do this at, let's say, 5 o'clock every day or around that time, then I want to make sure that I'm doing something other than whatever I'm typically doing at 5 that is associated with drinking alcohol. So I probably, maybe I want to make sure I'm going on a walk with friends at that time of day. Or maybe I want to make sure that that's the time of day that I'm studying, or whatever it might be. I want to change those antecedents so that those triggers are not present. And I might even decide that I want to use punishment. Punishment is something that we don't always use in behavior modification. We don't use it frequently, but it can be used. And so first of all, we need to remember you don't use punishment alone. You want to use it in combination with positive reinforcement. And so what you're wanting to do is make sure that when the person or when you are engaging in that undesired behavior and you have a negative consequence for that, you want to reinforce yourself whenever you are engaging in that desired behavior. So you might, for example, think about doing something that you think about a punisher that you really don't like. So for example, and you want to make sure it's pretty mild. So you want to make sure you can actually do this, administer it to yourself. And your textbook provides an example of participants who wrote a check out to an organization that they didn't like. So they wrote a check out to a campaign of a political candidate that they despised. And this could be a very strong motivation. So it could be that you have to, really, you need to think of for yourself, what would be the most punishing for you, or would be most effective as a punisher for you, but that is still mild, something that's not harmful to you, and something that you would be willing to administer. So then once you do that, once you come up with your program, you're going to now, over the same period of time that you gathered your data, you're going to now administer your program. You're going to execute it, and then you're going to do this over the same period of days, and then you're going to evaluate the effectiveness. And as you execute it, you're keeping a journal, you're recording the frequency of the behavior, and then you're going to be able to see if you've had a change in behavior. Now, I will tell you, there is another approach that's in addition to what's provided in your textbook. Another approach you could take would be to do something that's called an ABA design. And so this is where you are measuring the baseline behavior, and then you are going to have an intervention, and then you are going to measure the behavior. I'm sorry, it's an ABAB design. And so you're going to administer the intervention after you've measured your target behavior. So you have let me rephrase this, sorry. So you start out with your first thing, which is going to be measuring your target behavior. Then you're going to administer your intervention. Then you're going to measure your target behavior when you are administering your intervention. Then you're going to go back to having no intervention, and you're going to measure your behavior. And then you can go back to an intervention and measure your behavior. And this way you could really see if the intervention was the factor that was causing the change in your behavior. That's more if we were wanting to do a research on this. I just wanted to throw that out there because, you might hear about that in future courses that you take. But if you're just doing a self-modification program, you could just do the measure your target behavior, so you're gathering that baseline data, and then do your intervention and evaluate the intervention. And then you can end your program, and you may want to, you're going to want to figure out how are you going to maintain that program over the long period. Now, I want to say, if we look at this here, here's an example. This is from your textbook, the steps in the self-modification program. If we want to increase the likelihood that we're going to be successful when we use a behavior modification intervention for ourselves or for someone else, it can be very helpful to use what's called a behavioral contract. And I have an example of one here. In this example, this might be one that you would use for yourself. So perhaps you've come up with an intervention and you've come up with exactly what the consequences are going to be if, let's say, that you meet your goal or you don't engage in the desired behavior. And so you can modify this to include things like negative consequences. Remember, what we want to do with behavior modification, though, is we want to minimize the use of punishment and use as much reinforcement as we can. If we do use punishment, we want to pair it with reinforcement. It's also important to be specific, so you'll see a lot of openings here for specific information to be provided. And then two, we also want to think about how important it is to identify those antecedent stimuli that are going to be potentially leading to those behaviors that we don't want to engage in. And so we don't want to not include those. And we might not state those in the contract, but we need to make sure that we're including those in the intervention. And then it's also important that we publicize what we're going to do. If we're keeping it to ourselves, we don't have as much accountability. I've got a few test yourself questions. So let's get started and take a look at those. So let's look at this one. Malik is trying to improve his study skills, and in particular, he wants to increase the amount of time that he spends studying in one sitting. He doesn't want to cram. Rather, he'd like to get in a regular habit of reading for a total of 3 hours after his afternoon classes. Malik tells you that he can study for about 15 minutes right now and can't do much more than that. Which of the following behavior modification strategies do you think would be the best first step for Malik? So there's a big difference between 15 minutes and 3 hours. So think about which strategy would we use when we're kind of distant from what our goals are. If you're not sure about what the answer is, you could take a look back in your notes, in your book, or at a slide earlier in this video. If you know the answer, go ahead and move forward. The answer to this is shaping. So we use shaping when there's a discrepancy, a pretty decent sized discrepancy between where we currently are and where we want to go. The example that I provided you earlier was running a marathon. So perhaps you're not a runner, maybe you walk quite a bit. And so you're in pretty decent shape, but again, you're not running much and you want to be able to run a marathon. Well, you're not going to start out with having a goal of being able to run a 10K and not having any intermediate steps. So we want to have those intermediate steps along the way so that we can be reinforced as we gradually reach our goal. Let's look at another one. You're in your classroom an hour early before Professor Smith's infamously difficult cumulative final. You've been diligent all semester, reading all the assigned pages, taking copious notes, and even dropping by office hours when you need clarification. As a result, you're not at all stressed about the final, and you even feel a bit sleepy, although you've had adequate rest. Suppose you follow the predictions of the inverted U hypothesis. So this is requiring you to think about what you learned in an earlier video and earlier in the chapter. What would you most likely want to do in order to perform best on the challenging final? So remember that inverted U hypothesis. We're going to want to have that optimal level of stimulation. So what do we need to do? Do we want to be understimulated, overstimulated, right in the middle? How do we get there? If you don't remember this inverted U hypothesis, make sure you go back and take a look at this in your textbook. If you do know about it and you think you know the answer, let's move forward. The correct answer is drink a caffeinated drink and run back to class. So ask yourself, why would this be the case? Why would we want to do that? what we're doing is we're increasing our level of arousal to that optimum level. You'll notice here, you're not at all stressed and you're actually feeling sleepy. So you want to increase that level of arousal so your peak level of functioning. Let's look at one more. Your friend Raj studies for his psychology exams at the student union. The times he usually buckles down to study are 9 to 11 p.m. and they're usually rather quiet so he can be focused and productive. Unfortunately, just after 9:30 p.m., a bunch of sorority members begin rehearsing for their Greek week skits. They are loud and boisterous, but unfortunately or fortunately for Taj, the skits begin at 10 in the auditorium. So Raj is experiencing what? So what is he experiencing? Is this an anticipatory stressor, environmental, chronic, or acute? So if you're not sure, go back and take a look at your notes. If you think you know the answer, let's see if you're right. The correct answer is acute. That's that short-term stressor. Now, if it continued for a long period of time, let's say that everywhere that Raj goes on campus, regularly there's a lot of noise and this continues, then it would become a chronic stressor. If he was worried about going to the student union and worried about whether or not he would be able to study, then that is an anticipatory stressor. So this concludes our third part of this video on chapter 3. Please let me know what questions you have, and I look forward to seeing you all online.